Hey everybody, this video is called God's Miraculous Provision, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, where we're going to look at God's miraculous provision for Samaria. And so, chapter 7, verses 1 and 2 starts out, Then Elisha said, Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, Tomorrow about this time a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, at the gate of Samaria. So an officer on whose hand the king leaned answered the man of God and said, Look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, could this thing be? And he said, In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it. So a seah for a shekel was approximately 7 quarts of flour that would sell for approximately 2/5 of an ounce of silver. And 2 seahs for a shekel was about 13 to 14 quarts of barley that would also sell for 2/5 of an ounce of silver. And these prices indicated that the very next day that the famine in Samaria would end. And if you remember where we left off in our last chapter, chapter 6, verse 25, it said, And there was a great famine in Samaria, and indeed they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and 1/4 of a cab of dove droppings for 5 shekels of silver. So remember that interesting verse in verse 25 about donkey's head and all that. And in ancient Israel, the gate of the city was the marketplace where business was transacted, such as we saw back in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 1 and 2, and 2 Samuel, chapter 15, verse 1 through 5. And normal trade at the city gate of Samaria indicated that the seas would be lifted, and that the king depended upon this officer as his advisor. And the royal official questioned the Lord's ability to provide food within a day. And for that offense against God, we see that Elisha predicted that this officer would witness the promised miracle, but he would not eat of it. And the prophecy fulfillment is described, as we're going to see in the upcoming verses, verse 16 and 17. And I know many of us today, we would love to see inflation, calm down and lower again. And, Israel, they had inflation as well at this point. And the royal official doubted the power of God and the messenger of God. And he is the picture of unbelief. In verse 3 through 5, it says, Now there was 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall only die. And they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there. So the account of these lepers is used to tell of the season's end and the provisions that were going to take place for Samaria and the area outside of the city gate. And we see that the 4 lepers, they lived and they were shut out of Samaria because of their disease, which we know from the law in Leviticus 13 verse 46, it says that's what would happen to people such as lepers in Numbers chapter 5 verse 3. And the lepers knew that living in Samaria, whether inside or outside of the gate, offered them nothing but death. And the outskirts of the Syrian camp is the edge, and it referred to the back edge of the army camp and the furthest point from the wall of Samaria. And unfounded Jewish traditions tell us that the 4 lepers were Gehazi and his sons, but we don't have an actual confirmation of that. That is just Jewish traditional belief. In verse 6 and 7 it says, "For the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of the chariots, and the noise of the horses, the noise of the great army. So they said to one another, Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the king of the Hittites and the king of the Egyptians to attack us. Therefore arose and fled at twilight, and left the camp intact, their tents, their horses, their donkeys, and they fled for their lives." And so verses 6 and 7 here, sometime before the arrival of the lepers, the Lord made the Syrians hear the terrifying noise of a army approaching, and it was a sound of a large army that was approaching, and they thought that the Israelite king had hired two massive foreign armies to attack them. And the Hittites were descendants of the once great Hittite empire, who lived in small groups across northern Syria. And Egypt was at a decline at this point, at this time, but its army would still be represented as a great danger to the Syrians. And Israel was powerless, but God is all powerful. What man can't do, God can do. And God put the noise in the air as a perception of noise for the Syrian soldiers' minds. And the same God struck one Syrian army so that they could not see what was there, to now hear things that weren't there. God caused them to pretty much hallucinate. And everything was left behind, and the siege of Syria was over, and even though no one in the city knew it or enjoyed it. In verse 8 and 9 it says, "And when the lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent and ate and drank and carried from it silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried some of them from there also and went and hid it. And then they said to one another, We are not doing right. The day is a good day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." So verses 9 and 10 here, or 8 and 9, after the long famine period, the lepers answer to hope and prayer, and the answer was found. And the lepers, they rightly enjoyed the miracle that God provided, but they also realized that even though they experienced the good thing that God has done for them, they had the responsibility to go tell others, to share the good news with others. And likewise, when we are saved, and when we are born again, we have the responsibility to go tell others about Jesus and what Jesus has done for us. And they enjoyed the feast first before they told others about it. And the lepers did not fear of the Syrians would return, but that the Lord would punish them for their sin of not telling the Israelite king of their discovery. And verse 10 through 15 says, "So they went and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, saying, We went to the Syrian camp, and surprisingly no one was there, not a human sound, only horses and donkeys tied and the tents intact. And the gatekeepers called out, and they told it to the king's household inside. So the king arose in the night and said to his servants, Let me now tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry, therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, When they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city. And one of the servants answered and said, Please let several men take 5 of the remaining horses which are left in the city. Look that they may either become like all the multitude of Israel that are left in it, or indeed, I say, they may be like come all the multitude of Israel left from those who are consumed. So let us send them and see. Therefore they took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them in the direction of the Syrian army, saying, Go and see. And when they went after them to the Jordan, and indeed all the road was full of garments and weapons, which the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. So the messengers returned and told the king. And so the lepers could only communicate with the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers, they were a channel of communication to the king. And the gatekeepers, Jehoram greeted the report of the lepers with great suspicion, rightfully so. And he thought that the Syrians were pretending the pullback to appear defeated in order to lure the Israelites out of Samaria for a surprise attack on them to gain entrance into the city. And in verses 13 to 15, we see that the lepers' report is confirmed. In verse 16, it says, "Then the people went out and plundered the tents of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord." So we see the fulfillment here of Elisha's prophecy. And to wrap up the chapter here, verse 17 through 20 says, "Now the king had appointed the officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people trampled him in the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came out to him. So it happened, just as the man of God had spoken to the king, that 2 seahs of barley for a shekel and a seah of fine flour for a shekel shall be sold tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria." Then the officer had answered the man of God and said, "Now look, if the Lord would make the windows in heaven, could such a thing be?" And he said, "In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." So it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died. So we see that this doubting officer of the king is trampled upon unto his death, as others got to enjoy God's blessings. But we see that he didn't get to enjoy God's blessings because of his unbelief. And unbelief is very problematic for us. And so to wrap up today's chapter, we looked at God's promise, and we see the doubt of the king's officer. And we saw 4 lepers come upon the deserted Syrian camp. And we looked at how God caused the Syrians to abandon their camp. And then we got to see that the lepers, who were the least among society, got to enjoy the blessings of God. They enjoyed the feast because God provides. And they realized that where they were picked up by God, that they had the responsibility to tell others of the good things that God had done for them. And we saw that the king discovered the empty camp of the Syrian army. And we saw the fulfillment of the prophecy, and we see the death at the very end of this short chapter of the king's doubting officer. And, you know, the one nugget that I want you to get out of today's message is that if God has done great things for you, which he has, go tell others about it. Go tell others what Christ has done. And, you know, the good news, the gospel. And that's going to wrap up today's video. And we'll see you next as we're going to be looking at the new kings in Samaria and Judah in chapter 8. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you again next time. God bless.